You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 26th of April 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Portugal changes its years without a dictatorship flip counter to 50. The new issue of Monocle reveals the world's 50 best designed things. And why do we queue? And why should we? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers unhorsed earliest in this week's jousting tournament were Thomas Lewis, Carlotta Rebello, Grace Charlton, Nick Manise and Gunnar Gronlid. They'll discuss the student protests across the US, the 50th anniversary of Portugal's Carnation Revolution, the Monocle Design Awards and the art and science of queuing, and we'll meet the author of a new book recalling the extraordinary events of this week half a century ago in Lisbon. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we will start in the United States, where protests against Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza are continuing to consume university campuses. Arrests have been made at schools in New York City, Los Angeles, Austin and Atlanta, among others. The epicenter of the protest movement does appear to be Columbia University in New York. And I'm joined first of all today by Monocle's Toronto correspondent and Columbia alumnus, Thomas Lewis. Thomas, first of all, are you surprised to see your alma mater acting up like this? Was it a revolutionary hotbed when you were attending?
Well, not because of me, Andrew, but yes, the history of Columbia as a centre of student protests is a really long and pretty rich one. And it is the kind of history that's imparted to you as soon as you sort of step across the threshold of this glorious big campus on New York's Upper West Side. But I've been chatting to a lot of friends who I made during my sort of year at Columbia as a journalism student all those years ago, and we've all been sort of pretty agog, actually. I think just at how hard line that the university itself has been from the beginning of this latest round of protests against its own students. And I think that's what's really shocked sort of most of us, and I think probably has added more fuel to the protests that are actually happening, which of course is being covered in pretty different ways depending where on the campus you are or if you're outside the perimeter of the university, which I think is pretty significant.
I will come back to the subject of the coverage, but of the university authorities' response to the protest, what has surprised you about it? Would you expect them to be more indulgent of it, given that tradition that you mention?
I think so. And I think, I covered for Monocle many years ago, just I think a week after Donald Trump was inaugurated as US president, Andrew. And we were doing a story about how US journalists were covering those tumultuous sort of first couple of days of the presidency. And we went to the campus of Columbia and there was a huge protest there, very peaceful, against the new president, against his behaviour towards women, I think was, if I recall correctly, the big sort of theme. But there was a microphone, speakers coming up, people chanting, and that felt like sort of the kind of protests that I had known myself kind of at Columbia as a student there. I think obviously, given that these protests now aren't the first to have roiled US campuses since October the 7th and Hamas's attacks on Israel. And I think some of us are deducing, kind of that, just how harsh the university has been with this latest round of protests, arresting 100 students, sending officers of the NYPD onto the campus. It just has felt very harsh and kind of slightly anomalous, if you like, to that long history of protests over things like the Vietnam War, for example, or the University of Columbia's investment in apartheid South Africa over the years, that this really has felt like a very harsh response. And it's, in a way, it's only sort of galvanized the protesters who, if you listen, Andrew, to many of the faculty or students who are actually allowed on campus, they say that it's a very different picture to what a lot of the media coverage has been, as I hinted at a little earlier.
Well, on that subject, I mean, would you say there has been a general tone of media coverage of these protests? Are they basically, well, in much the same way it might be argued that the students are themselves recycling the 1960s dynamic and assume that all of these people are fifth columnists and communist subversives or whatever the modern equivalent is?
I think there is definitely a climate more broadly in the US, Andrew. And if we look at where this latest round of protests and the tented encampment on the grounds of the campus at Columbia was marked when the president of Columbia, Manu Shafiq, went to Washington, D.C. to give testimony about the safety of Jewish students at Columbia in front of a congressional panel. Now, of course, you'll remember that some of her counterparts at other universities have essentially lost their jobs by doing the same on this very same topic not that long ago. And I think a lot of the students felt that the president of Columbia University had essentially thrown the university, students and members of faculty sort of under the bus to try and sort of placate the more sort of on the right wing of the Republican Party, who have, really been pursuing this as part of a broader idea of the culture war, I think. I don't think there's much interest from them in kind of the nuance of what freedom of speech on a university campus, which is a very precious thing in the United States, should be. It's about sort of adding another piece of the jigsaw of an overall kind of view of America, I think. That would be my take anyway. And obviously we're coming up, Andrew, just briefly to graduation season. We saw that USC in California, they've cancelled their graduation ceremony. It's unclear in Emory, which we saw some really pretty violent video captured by CNN on campus yesterday, what they will do in the coming weeks as graduation season gets underway. But I think there are questions about whether those students will actually stay on campus after they're meant to have graduated, if the momentum of this they feel is still with them.
Thomas Lewis in Toronto, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. This is The Daily with me, Andrew Muller. Joining me now to explain why we were listening to that is Monocle's senior foreign correspondent, Carlotta Rebello. Carlotta, exactly that question. What the heck were we just listening to and why were we listening to it?
Show some respect, Andrew, please. You were listening to Portugal's 1974 entry to the Eurovision Song Contest.
It didn't win.
It did not win, but it did something much better, which was the signal, the first code that propelled the Carnation Revolution, which happened 50 years ago yesterday. So this is a revolution that put an end to the Estado Novo regime. That's the fascist dictatorial regime of Antonio Salazar. And as part of the coup that was led by the armed forces, by the military, this song was played on the radio station, the national broadcaster, because, of course, as that year's entrance to the Eurovision Song Contest, it wouldn't be weird or absurd to be listening to the song and hearing it on the radio. So that was the first code to tell the troops that the coup was going to happen. And then there was a second song played a couple of hours later that basically signaled there's no way back. There's no turning back. The revolution is in motion.
I mean, it's obviously a colossally significant date for your country. This is the foundation of Portugal as the modern European democracy that we have come to know. 50th anniversaries are obviously a pretty big one. How is it being commemorated in Portugal today?
Well, it was commemorated yesterday. But
the celebrations could be ongoing, Carlotta.
Yes, I guess if you have a bank holiday on a Thursday, that is a correct assumption. It was actually, so traditionally there are, of course, marches throughout the country, but the significant one is, as the name might indicate, the big march through Avenida da Liberdade, the Freedom Avenue in Lisbon, which tends to be quite significant, named so, of course, after the freedom, the revolution. And from all accounts, by all accounts, looking at the newspapers and the coverage yesterday and this morning, it was the biggest number of people attending ever. The images and videos are quite striking. I can't really remember seeing that many people on the street. And we need to put also this into context. It's not only the 50 years of the Carnation Revolution, but it coincides with a new government that was elected last month. And as part of that election, for the first time since the dictatorship, we have far right back in parliament in big numbers. At the moment, Portugal has one member of parliament of the far right per year of freedom. So 50 years of the Carnation revolutions happen when we have 50 members of the Chega far right party elected. So it's worrying, and that's why so many people also took to the streets to say that, despite the results, that is not representative of the entirety of the nation. And that the values that the revolution wanted to bring of freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom, women being able to work, you being able to gather with more than two people and not being considered a conspiracy, being able to listen to music and eat food from other countries. And that's just, not even to go into the really bad ones like censorship, repression of, freedom of thought, being arrested by thinking not in line with the state. Those values are still alive, and it was really nice to see yesterday the special session in Parliament where the revolutionary songs were sung and the members of the government and of the parties were wearing the red carnation across their chest, and with former members of government in present as well, and also some of what we call the captains of April. And on that point, and this point of the European and international relevance of the Carnation Revolution, yesterday coincided as well that it was the last session of the European Parliament ahead of the elections that are happening in June, and Roberta Metsola, the European Parliament President, made a mention. So let's have a listen.
Today, dear colleagues, marks the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. A moment in the timeline of European history that reverberates and inspires still. A date where democracy, freedom and dignity took back their rightful place in Portugal, and serves as a reminder to us to never take these cornerstone European values for granted.
The President of the European Parliament celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution. Also, I understand, Carlotta, President Emmanuel Macron of France attempted to join your party.
Yes, and he not only attempted, I think he successfully joined the party and gave what can only be described as quite a moving speech. All credit to Macron and his speechwriting team, because they had done their research. And a bit of context for listeners, throughout the dictatorship, we need to remember that Spain also had a dictatorship.
Indeed so.
So France was the first safe haven for those who were escaping the majority of time on foot from Portugal to try to find Europe that was free. And France became home for a lot of the revolutionaries, including more famously Álvaro Cunhal and Mário Soares, who are part of the freedom movement and basically helped instigate the revolution from abroad, from France. Indeed, Grândola Vila Morena, which is the song of protest that was sung in Parliament, was recorded in France by Zeca Afonso, and Macron mentioned that in his speech. So there's a big connection between the freedom that Portugal has. Of course, we know Fraternité, Égalité as well from France. There's a connectivity there as well. But if it wasn't for that safe haven, we don't know how France played a big role in that, in harbouring Portuguese dissidents. And let's hear a bit of what Macron had to say.
We owe it to the memory of the April captains and the Portuguese people who 50 years ago stood up against injustice and poverty, gaining admiration from France, Europe and the entire world, with a red carnation in their hands.
25 de abril, sempre. Viva Portugal, obrigado Portugal.
A really moving message there. and even an attempt at Portuguese at the end, Andrew. So I think it was a really good speech, and it really showcases the strong bond between the two nations that still continues today. And it's just quite nice to see other nations recognize the importance of this revolution for democracy in Europe today. One other very moving image was of a journalist in Kyiv holding a red carnation. She posted a video saying this is what freedom sounds like, and she was holding a red carnation with the sirens of the air raids playing in the background. And that's a reminder why it's important those values continue to be defended today.
Carlotta Rebello, thank you for joining us. Now, sticking with the theme of the Carnation Revolution, readers who would like to know more, and it is quite a story, can avail themselves of a new single-volume history of the events of April 1974. It's called The Carnation Revolution, The Day Portugal's Dictatorship Fell. It's by Alex Fernandez, and I spoke to him earlier, and I began by asking him about that 1974 Eurovision entry.
Well, what would you like to know about it? Because I'm actually been asked to go back to write a little bit more about that than I've covered in the book. I think it was a surprise for Paulo de Carvalho, who performed the song at the Eurovision Song Contest, that it would be used to trigger a revolution, because he, by his own admission, wasn't at the time a member of the opposition. He didn't consider himself an anti-fascist, although he became one. Like a lot of people started considering themselves anti-fascists after the revolution happened. But I think it's an extraordinary story, because when it was chosen as the song, as the first signal for the armed forces movement to begin their operation on the evening of the 24th of April, I think a journalist at the time, in an interview with Hotel Saraiva de Carvalho, who made the decision, said it was some banality, some banal song that nobody would think twice about. And that was for a few reasons, one of which is that it was the songs that they wanted to use that were more progressive, that were a symbol of the progressive nature of the coup. Many of them were banned either by radio stations or by the regime as a whole. So they needed something that they could play on the radio station that they'd chosen to start things off, basically.
I was interested in the way that the book is structured. You start off more or less every chapter with a description of a particular locale, a place in Lisbon, and then you weave its significance to the events of April 1974 into that chapter. Was that a way of trying to demonstrate that it's not ancient history, this revolution? It is objectively, obviously, only 50 years ago, but that modern Portugal is still very much a product of those 24 hours.
I think not just modern Portugal, but also some of the things that I talk about earlier on in the book are monuments that were built in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, cemeteries and things like that. Yeah, I think it was a way of making it real for people who might read the book and might one day visit Lisbon. But I also the book started out in my head as the idea for it was actually as a walking tour of Lisbon. So I think the presence of those locations, initially I'd started to try and link them together to allow somebody to maybe start in one place and end somewhere else. Obviously that didn't work out. Lisbon is a huge place. There's a lot of history to cram into locations, but that was the original impetus for the book, and the idea of the location stuck.
All revolutions are different, but does it strike you that there is something distinctly Portuguese about this one, for all that it was effectively a coup d'etat by a group of disaffected young officers? It was more or less entirely peaceful.
Are you asking if it being peaceful was something inherently Portuguese? Or I don't think that I think that every revolution is unique. And is a product of the circumstances that led to it. And I think if you ask most historians, they'll tell you that a revolution in Portugal sometime in that period was inevitable for one reason or another. Portugal had been embroiled in a colonial war for 13 years. That it was being led by the armed forces also comes from a long history of people within the Portuguese armed forces rising up against the regime, many times, in fact, most times failing and being arrested or killed as a result of that. So I think in that sense, it is a very Portuguese revolution, because it was, I guess you could call it, the final domino in a long line of dominoes falling, each of which had failed for their own reasons, but this was the one that stuck. And all of that is carried in over 50 years of Portuguese history.
When you were assembling your narrative, and the book, to be clear to our listeners, does absolutely bounce along like a matinee thriller. It's almost minute by minute of this extraordinarily compressed and important period in Portugal's history. But were there points in that 24 hours in particular at which, if something had happened not very much differently, then this revolution might have come unstuck like lots of previous ones? Was its success always foreordained?
Absolutely. I think that there were a few moments that the organizers of the coup were actually walking on a tightrope. And if one or another person had made a different decision in the spur of the moment, then there would have been a bloodbath on the streets of Lisbon. There would have been gunfire going in every direction, and the revolutionaries very likely would have failed, or they would have succeeded, but it wouldn't be considered, as it is now, a bloodless revolution. To give you one example, there was a moment where Captain Salgueiro Maia, who was one of the leaders of the cavalry convoy that occupied the center of the city, faces off against Brigadier General, and the Brigadier General orders one of his subordinates to open fire. And the subordinate in that moment refuses the order. And if he hadn't refused that order, Salgueiro Maia would have become a martyr of the revolution, and God knows what would have happened next. And there's dozens of instances like that, that if things had gone slightly differently, even in the run-up, then things would have gone completely awry, and the revolution might never have happened as it happened.
The obvious hook for your book is the 50th anniversary of these events, but do you think, perhaps even worry, that it has acquired an accidental timeliness as well, in that Portugal has just elected 50-odd far-right MPs to its parliament? Do you worry that these events and the reasons for these events are beginning to be forgotten?
It's interesting that you pose that question like that, because I think that, as we can see across Europe, I think there's a limit to historical memory. And I think that one of the reasons why Portugal has, in its modern history, had a series of progressive governments, or relatively progressive governments relative to the rest of Europe, is as a result of the immediacy of the Portuguese Revolution, which you can compare, for example, to Spain, which had a completely different collapse of its fascist regime. And they don't talk about it, and then you have a sort of different approach to historical memory. But I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've hit a limit to that. We've hit a limit to how significant the events of the revolution were in the minds of Portuguese people. We also have hit a limit on how brutal and horrible the memories of what came before are, due to an aging and dying population that did remember what it was like before the revolution happened. So, and I think it's an unfortunate, almost macabre joke that in the last month, 50 members of the far right have been elected into the Portuguese parliament. I think it's a real shame on the 50th anniversary of the revolution that that's what happened. But as I write in the epilogue to the book, I have faith that we're not going to slide much further in that direction as a country.
That was Alex Fernandez speaking to me earlier. His excellent book, The Carnation Revolution, The Day Portugal's Dictatorship Fell, is available now. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. This is The Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and on a superior newsstand near you now is the May 2024 edition of Monocle magazine. Among the many marvels contained therein is the 2024 Monocle Design Awards, and joining me to discuss what cracked the top 50 are Monocle's design editor, Nick Monisse, and Monocle writer, Grace Charlton. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello, Andrew Muller.
And given that listeners will already have discerned that this is an all-Australian design discussion...
We're not talking design awards.
We are going to talk design awards.
Okay,
no, sorry.
I thought it was something else.
You threw me entirely there. I thought, sorry, what? Have I missed a meeting? It's the sort of thing I would miss. We should start with Australia's entry in the top 50. Nick.
Absolutely.
Especially since it is from Sydney, where Grace and I are both fortunate enough to have come from, while you were not.
Yeah, and look, I'm not even going to try and dispute that. We don't need to get into Perth like we normally do. Let's focus on Sydney.
Perth isn't in the top 50, is it, Nick?
No, Andrew, it's not in the top 50.
No.
Have you been to Perth?
No, why would I do that?
Okay, never mind. Perth's lovely. And big shout out to my mum, who's probably listening from Perth.
It's just, I'm sure it is. It's just all the way over there.
It's a direct flight from London, but I digress. Let's actually, Andrew, come on. Can we please be professional? I would love to talk about Maranowie Cove, which is the first public beach installed, I guess is the word, in the inner harbour of Sydney for the first time in 50 years. So this was completed by SMC Marine, who basically analysed the site conditions and wave patterns of an inlet near Barangaroo and installed a seawall and shark barrier and swimming platforms and changing rooms and showers and signage, and made it a place where you can actually swim with a view of the Harbour Bridge and Opera House. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I think, so the Design Awards are about picking, I guess, benchmarks and outstanding examples of design. And for me, this is an incredibly difficult project to execute in incredibly difficult conditions, and they've done it in a way that feels authentic to the place. Like it feels like it's been there for a long time, which I think is an incredible challenge. They've used recycled stone to build these swimming platforms, and really, I guess, also enhance the character of the place. I mean, if you're in Sydney, you want to be swimming in the water near the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, which previously wasn't something you could easily do. I mean, Grace, would you jump in here? You've seen the images of it.
100%. I mean, it looks amazing.
I am planning to jump in there literally on my next visit. It does look fantastic.
With your little floaties on your arms, I assume, Andrew.
Obviously. Well, I'm wearing them now. Grace, do you have any particular favourites from this? If we have to consider the entries from lesser nations, which ones jump out at you?
I really like this fire extinguisher that I found at Stockholm Furniture Fair, of all places.
Had you set something ablaze?
No, but I could have, and I would have been fine. This is a student project by Albin Jonsson. He's a student in industrial design at Lund University, and he did test this fire extinguisher in his parents' backyard using baking soda as a sort of more eco-friendly alternative.
Had he set fire to something, or was it?
He did.
Testing? Okay.
He did. Yeah.
He's very forgiving parents. Mine used to get terribly cross with me when I set fire.
Yeah, last time I did that, I got grounded, which was fair. To be honest, that was fair. I was 11 and I shouldn't have been playing with matches. But I wanted to ask, so Andrew, you constantly check in with Grace and I at various design fairs around the world.
I do. I've begged them to excuse me.
Curious about the worth of it. But Grace, I mean, this is case in point of why we go. I mean, I don't think we would have come across this project otherwise.
For sure. And he's now featured next to some of the biggest brands like Fritz Hansen, and I think hopefully he's really chuffed with it, because fire extinguishers often are not thought of as design pieces.
No.
Which is a shame, because they're everywhere for obvious reasons. But I found this one.
This one is kind of beautiful. It looks like a magic wand.
Exactly.
And again, this is coming back to why we pick these projects. I mean, I'm the sort of person that can easily let my day get ruined by a little thing, and I have. I specifically remember being in an art gallery in Palma, Mallorca last summer, and just completely being enraged by the fact that we had these beautiful artworks alongside bright red fire extinguishers. So the fact that you picked this out, Grace, is I'm going to be forwarding it to this gallery in Palma.
Nick, to go back to you, talk to us about a chair, specifically PK4.
I've picked this out for you because I know how much you love talking chairs. I mean, Andrew, you have a bottom and you like to rest it on perches. Is that a fair assumption?
I have chairs in my house where I live. I've nothing against chairs, Nick. I wish to make it clear to listeners I'm sitting in one right now.
And are you enjoying yourself?
It's all right. It's a nice chair.
I tell you what, we could elevate that experience by parking you in a PK4 by Fritz Hansen.
This looks a bit low slung for this table.
Well, I mean, it's what are we, 6 p.m. on a Friday night? I feel like low slung is exactly what we're going for. But this is a design from 1952. It's an archival revival that they've pulled out. It was, I guess, the whole story behind this is Denmark has this amazing design heritage, and it's all about, I guess, digging into their own archives and reissuing them. The fact that they've reissued this is significant because it looks as modern today as it did back in the day, and I think that's what really, really makes it special.
We do like at Monocle, Grace, a nice-looking shop. Regular leaders, and indeed regular readers will both be aware. You have picked one out. It's a beautiful-looking shop in Milan, and when I say a beautiful-looking shop, it looks very much like the kind of place that if Nick or I set 1 foot inside the doors, we would be bundled back onto the footpath in fairly short order.
You've never shopped at Bottega Veneta?
I don't think I can even afford to look at it.
Well, it does look expensive. It's in Milan's Galleria Vittorio Emanuele's second sort of shopping mall next to the Duomo. It is so beautiful. It uses a lot of marble, walnut, glass. It's just stunning. It's very inspired by Italian modernism, and it's in keeping with the brand's creative director Mathieu Blazy's vision for Bottega, and he loves a bit of Carlo Scarpa famously. And I just think retail design is something that's really important and needs to be given, you know, careful attention. So we gave this one an award because it's just beautiful.
But judging by the pictures at least, it does seem to have pulled off that extremely difficult trick of looking very, very old school while at the same time managing to conjure something of that modernism you were talking about.
And it's quite a small space. I think it's very intimate. And he said it wanted to feel like a dressing room. That's not what my dressing room currently looks like, but it's definitely inspirational.
And just a couple more picks from each, or one more pick from each of you. Nick, there was something in the United Arab Emirates that caught your eye.
So I was at Dubai Design Week last year, and it's an event, I mean, Grace has covered it before as well. We've definitely phoned into you and tried to get you excited about the prospects of design coming from this region.
While I phoned in my response.
Andrew, please be professional. We've talked about this. These are the meetings. You've got to stop skipping these meetings where we talk about professionalism. But I mean, this was their bespoke commission for the year. It was the Of Palm Pavilion by Muller, which is not your surname, but rather the name of a design agency in the UAE run by Abdullah Muller. And what I loved about this, look, it was only in place for a week, but as the name suggests, it was inspired and made from palm trees. And for me, it's, you know, we're at this age where we've got to be thinking about how we're building, how we're making, like, can we rely on concrete, glass and steel for everything? Mm-hmm. It's probably not the best for the environment, and certainly in terms of enhancing somewhere with a sense of place. You're not necessarily going to do that with glass, metal and concrete, but instead, by using a local material like palm trees, like Abdullah has here, he was able to not only show the potential of it to be used in a host of different forms. They formed it into blocks for walls. They turned it into tiles for the roof. It also grounds it in place. And I think that that's something that we all yearn to hang on to. I mean, you look at that Bottega Veneta store in Milan, it feels like not only is it Bottega Veneta, but it belongs in Milan. And this pavilion for me really showed that it belongs in the UAE. And it really sets a benchmark for how we might want to build, how we can consider local materials, how we can imbue, I guess, structures with a strong sense of place.
And Grace, on the subject of places with not only a strong sense of place, but a very, very recognisable design sensibility, you have a pick from Mexico.
Exactly. OMET is a new design platform. It was founded by Lorena Vieira, who's a Mexico City-based architect, and she basically invited all these Mexican designers to reconsider what a modern Mexican craft sort of looks like. And she invited Tatiana Bilbao, who's an architect, and Marisol Conteno, who's a textile designer, to create these homewares. And I just love her mission, and it's all made in Mexico, and it's just really beautiful.
Well, we have, I think, there between us discussed 6 of the entries, which leaves potential readers 44 more they can be getting to grips with. That is all in the May 2024 edition of Monocle. Grace Charlton and Nick Moniz, thank you both for joining us. This is The Daily. You are listening to The Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and finally on today's show and returning to the theme of the May 2024 edition of Monocle, one scorching hot tip is to buy it if you are subsequently en route to stand in a queue for something, as beginning on page 83, there is a comprehensive feature on queuing, why we do it, how to do it, and what we can even learn by doing it. I'm joined now with more on this by Monocle researcher and Queue Desk chief, Gunnar Gromlid. Your piece posits, Gunnar, or the piece posits that the queue sort of got temporarily abolished by COVID-19. We were sort of sending out for stuff, and instead of standing in queues, because obviously standing in queues usually involves standing quite close to other people, but it is your contention that the queue has enjoyed something of a comeback, even if we didn't necessarily ourselves individually enjoy standing in them?
No, indeed. I mean, the queue has had an absolute renaissance, I guess, after COVID-19 has sort of slowed down and we can be back out there going to restaurants, going and getting our favorite bagels. And it is also a pest that we had sort of forgotten about, and now we have to contend with it again, how much it annoys us, and also how much we're not realizing that there's a whole part of queuing that can actually give us something. That's part of sort of what I've been writing about. Well,
see, this is what I wanted to challenge you on slightly. I was going to ask you to pitch me, if you will, the idea of queuing, because to set out my own stall here, I am an absolute non-queuer. Under no imaginable circumstances would I queue to get into a restaurant. I certainly wouldn't queue to get into a bar. I don't like queuing to spend my own money. I don't feel like I should be the one being inconvenienced here. I will often walk into a supermarket. If there is a long queue, I will walk out of it and go somewhere else. So what am I missing out on?
Well, actually, before I came to Monocle, funny enough, I studied psychology and neuroscience. I was doing research in those fields. And so one of the most exciting parts of queuing for me is how it actually reveals just getting into a waiting state completely changes the way that your brain is processing everything that's going on in your life. So the queue really is an opportunity for your brain to go into what's called the default mode network, which is often called the imagination network. It is the kind of processing your brain does when you're not doing anything in particular.
How do you get past seething irritation to that?
That's actually the trick, and that's true. So queuing, because it is so annoying, it can actually be difficult to get there. But if we cultivate a sort of appreciation and just ability to sit with ourselves, waiting, not doing anything in particular, in a society now where, of course, we want to be hyper-productive, we always want to be working, we always want to be doing something and feel like we're not wasting our time. But if we can cultivate waiting, then your brain goes into this thing called the default mode network, which is really where all of your sort of imagination lives. It's where your brain starts to connect ideas in your head of everything that's been going on in your life and sort of structure your future and give you new ideas. I mean, it's why people always say that they have their best ideas in the shower. It's when you're not doing anything in particular that your brain goes into this mode. And in the way that our society is now, the queue really is an opportunity to stop and wait and let your brain do all of those things that you miss out on if you're just going.
Except the trouble is, of course, that people in queues are now not doing that because they are gawping into their smartphones and or tweeting at the world about how bloody irritated they are about the queue they're standing in. But you do speak for this feature to several experts in different aspects of queuing. And one particular question that I wanted to put to you, given that we are sitting here in the United Kingdom, and this is a country which takes a perverse pride in being good queuers. The British like to think of themselves as that. But I have noticed in the quite long time I have lived here now that there's a lot less of it than there used to be. People don't stand in queues for buses anymore. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think overall it's probably a bad thing, but the funny thing as well is looking at different cultures of queuing. Yes, the UK sort of prides itself on being the culture of queuing. We have it on the citizenship test. Wimbledon Stadium has a 35-page how to queue manifesto that it tries to enforce on everyone. So clearly the UK is very proud of its queuing, but there's other cultures where they do queuing very differently. Like in China, they have a sort of buddy system where they have their friends stand in the queue for them and then they switch places or they pay someone to do it. And really one of the most fascinating things that I found about studying the queue, I wrote 5 different essays talking to 6 different experts on the economics of the queue, psychology of the queue, philosophy of the queue, cultures of queuing, and politics of the queue. And the most interesting thing about queuing really for me was that it really is a microcosm of so many different aspects of our society. And there's hundreds of experts, there's thousands of scientific papers, because queuing can show you both how the culture looks at waiting or looks at services. You can study the economy through it. You can think about also how queuing is used as a political weapon. All of these things are all wrapped up in this thing. So, that was really the most interesting part of me for looking into this.
Just finally then, what are your people like as queuers? How would you rate them?
To be honest, we are way less organised just in public spaces in general from people in the UK. I think we're pretty good at sort of lining up and all of that, and we love keeping distance away from each other. I think we were probably pretty good at social distancing because for me, the one thing I recognise as soon as I go back to Norway is that as soon as you get on a bus, there's almost a mathematical formula of how people sit in a bus or on a train to be as far away from each other as humanly possible. But at the same time, Norwegians, like if you go to a convenience store or something like that, we're always bumping into each other, crashing into each other. Whereas here, you guys are good at doing the lanes, doing the, walking on the left and standing still on the right. So, yeah.
Well, going back to COVID-19, of course, your near neighbours, the Finns, joked when they were told to stand 2 metres apart. Why so close? Gunnar Grunlid, thank you very much for joining us. And that is that, in fact, for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to all our guests today, Thomas Lewis, Carlotta Rebello, Nick Moniz, Grace Charlton and Gunnar Grunlid. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons with editing assistance from Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Have a great weekend and thanks for listening.